My presentation to catch up here. Oh, that is super loud. Can you turn me down just a little bit? Yeah. Unless we got anybody that likes it super loud. How's that sound? Okay, too much? If you start going like this. All right. Well, I show that we're at about just after 7 o'clock. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to this year's Storm Fury on the Plains Severe Weather Awareness, Preparedness, et cetera, education event. If you don't know me, my name is Carrie Cordles. I'm the Emergency Management Director for the county, and I will be taking you through your training tonight. How many of you here have done one of these Storm Fury on the Plains from the National Weather Service before? Got a handful? All right. Rest of you, I'm assuming, brand new to this? Oh, well, to give you a little bit of the backstory. So the National Weather Service has been creating these annual trainings for eons. These have been around for a long time. And originally they started out, the reason that you may hear this class sometimes referred to as spotter training is because initially it started out as something that was intended for folks that were meaning to get out in front of storms, intentionally wanting to get in the path of a storm, maybe not directly, but near a storm, and report back information, public safety information about what the storm was doing and who was in trouble and who needed to take protective actions. And so that's where they originally started as their target audience. And then over the years, they discovered that actually the general public overall, even people that would rather go hide under the bed when the storms were coming, were actually interested in learning more about severe weather. So they started to add a little more of a public education bent to it as well, not just a spotter focused. And now today's day and age, the current iteration of it, it's sort of a blend. There's still spotter information for the folks that are going out spotting, and a lot of just good general information to teach you how to be safe when you're tangling with storms. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to start out first with just a little video to kind of put us in the mood. And before you start it, don't start quite yet. I did want to, especially because we are in Andover tonight, tell you that a lot of the information tonight does have to do with last year's tornado. So kind of wanted to prep you, especially if you're somebody that was directly impacted by it. There is video, there's pictures from it. We will be doing a case study on kind of the meteorological buildup to that night. So just kind of wanted to get you in that mindset first, that since you guys are kind of ground zero. Okay, go ahead. And actually, out of deference to you guys, because like I said, you guys are ground zero, the last couple moments of that video actually was aerial overflight of some of the damaged neighborhoods. And in case any of you were the actual people who lived in those homes, I didn't want to put you through that again. But this presentation is actually what the National Weather Service has been using across their coverage area. So the National Weather Service office in Wichita covers 26 counties. And so they've been using this material all this season to teach about severe weather. So you guys' story here has been a case study for a lot of other communities about severe weather preparedness, about the importance of spotters, about how to be ready for storms and know whether you're in trouble from a storm. So we're going to start out tonight by looking at overall, because other things happened in 2022. I know it sometimes didn't feel like it, but other things happened in 2022 when it came to severe weather. So we're going to kind of look at globally, what did that year look like? And would you be surprised to hear that on the severe weather front, it actually was a bit of a bust of a year? Does that kind of surprise you, or did it feel like that if you look at all the other days except for April 29th? So it was, if you look at the warnings that were issued, anything weather related, whether it was a severe thunderstorm, a tornado warning, or a flash flood warning, any of the warnings that were issued by any of the National Weather Service offices that covered the state of Kansas, in total of all those warning types, 981 warnings were issued last year. And that's the red box. If you look at the blue box, this is how far off of normal we were. So almost 400 fewer warnings than what is our average in any given year. So definitely we were in a down year when it came to severe weather. And in fact, we had a pretty sharp drop off about mid-year because that's when we went into the drought. And so not only did we not have moisture in the sky, we didn't have moisture on the ground, there was like nothing to produce storms. This was actually, though, 2022 was the third year of a 3-year trend of just really down severe weather years. So if you look at 2021, about 300 less than normal. 2020, we were about 350 less than normal for severe weather. Now, I don't know any of you that are really into weather and climatology. Are you familiar with the La Nina and El Nino concepts? Heard that before? So during those 3 years, we were actually in a triple La Nina. So it was La Nina 3 years in a row, which doesn't happen very often. And so we're just finally breaking that climate pattern or that weather pattern in the transition period right now, going from La Nina, eventually working our way over to El Nino. And as the forecasters were looking at this, just to kind of give you a little sneak peek into their thoughts, they said, okay, looking back historically, the last time we actually did a triple La Nina, what happened when we finally broke that pattern? And like I said, it doesn't happen very often, but they looked back historically and found other times that we kind of dropped into this La Nina 3 times in a row. And they said in the year that we came back out of it, historically, that was an extremely, as they called it, a very active severe weather season. And if you've been keeping an eye on stuff to our east and down in the deep south, that does kind of seem to be panning out, doesn't it? This just gives you the same information in slightly a different representation, basically showing that if you look at the gray box to the far right, the 3 years, 2020 through 2022, we're definitely way below our average, which is the black bar of 1,200 warnings per year. So you can see there that we were off in just overall severe weather. But now if you look at it from a tornado perspective, we were way, way down in severe weather reports and kind of in a tornado slump if you want to look at it. So on average, now this is specifically looking not just at Kansas now, this is looking really zoomed in to those 26 counties that the National Weather Service office in Wichita supports, and says on an average year, we should have 25 tornadoes within that 26 county radius. And for that 3-year period, we had 24 total. So we didn't get anywhere close to the 25 per year. In fact, if you look at 2020, there were absolutely no tornado reports in 2020 in that entire 26 county warning area. So we were a little off. So does that make you think that maybe we don't do severe weather anymore? Maybe we don't have to worry about it. Maybe, as some people have speculated, Tornado Alley is shifting and it's not us anymore, and now it's somebody else's problem. Anybody starting to kind of get that feel that it's not us anymore? And we all know better, right? So keep in mind that even when we have below average years, even when things seem to slump and they seem to dip, and we've got a lot fewer warnings and a lot fewer storms, we don't go to 0 storms, do we? And even during a slump year, it really only takes that one day. And you guys unfortunately had that one day where it did get very significant and for some people very life-changing. So that's why we say don't get complacent, because even if the numbers sag a bit and we don't hit those averages and we don't hit those high periods, even during those years, it still happens in Kansas, doesn't it? Well, looking at the greatest hits of 2022, the National Weather Service office in Wichita looked at their statistics and said, okay, well, let's look at where did the biggest happen? The biggest tornado, the biggest hailstone, the strongest thunderstorm wind gust, and the most amount of rain. And I said, where did those land at? Nobody is probably surprised that the EF3 that went through this area on April 29th was the largest tornado that was reported in that 26 county warning area. And if you didn't ever see the survey information from that, you may be a little surprised to hear, maybe not, that they actually really struggled with giving that designation of an EF3. The National Weather Service survey crews actually came out 2 different days, both Saturday and Sunday, and they looked at the damage, and they scoured the damage, and they reviewed everything, because there are some in that Weather Service office that their gut feeling is it was actually an EF4. But they just could not find that damage that nailed it down strong enough for them to be able to say, yes, right here, here's that piece of evidence. So instead, what they called it was a very high EF3. But just beware, some people think it may have crossed that line. Fortunately, Butler County and City of Andover did not have the honor of hosting the largest hailstone, especially when you look at how big the largest hailstone was. Marion County got that award, I guess you could say, by hosting an apple-sized hailstone, which is larger than baseball at 3 1/4 inches. Definitely not something we needed to have down here. And then the strongest thunderstorm wind gust actually happened to be April 29th. Not here, but over in Greenwood County, close to Eureka, they recorded a 111 mile per hour straight line wind gust. So that's not a tornadic wind, that's just regular wind, straight line winds. And then not so surprising where the highest rainfall ended up at, because at least when we're having a normal year, southeast Kansas, they kind of suck all the moisture down there, and they're used to being kind of marshy and kind of heavily rainy. So the fact that the heaviest rain day was down near Parsons, and this was cumulative for a whole day, was nearly 8 inches of rain. How many of you would take just even a fraction of that right now? Just a little bit, please. Well, so the National Weather Service was trying to look at and say, okay, so where does Kansas still fall? When we try to rank us against other states, are we still a severe weather central? Are we still a place where we definitely do have to worry about substantial weather? But if you just try to compare state to state, I mean, it doesn't really play out fair if you compare Kansas to Texas, for example. They got a lot more mass. Of course, they're going to have a lot more stuff happen. So they did some fancy finagling with some numbers and said, okay, let's chunk it down into 10,000 square mile blocks and say, all right, what is the occurrence of severe weather per 10,000 square mile block? Because then we're essentially talking apples to apples. And then they said, let's look at it for hail, for wind, and for tornadoes. And as you can see, when you look at large hail, Kansas wins. I don't know if it's something we want to win, but we have the most reports of golf ball or larger hailstones within a 10,000 square mile block. If you look at damaging wind, so 70 miles per hour or greater, again, we're at the top. We've got 24 reports per 10,000 square mile blocks. So again, definitely do wind. I mean, if you think about it, Kansas, we excel at wind, don't we? We're really good at that. And then when you look at tornadoes, we actually weren't number one. Somehow we lost out to Florida. But Mississippi and Florida were just a hair above us at 10.6 reports per 10,000 square miles, and we were 10.5. And if you've been kind of watching the map off to the side, sort of that heat map, you can see where that concentration reports comes in. Now, if you ball all of it together, all severe weather hazards, we win by a long shot. 62 reports compared to Oklahoma, the closest at 50. So yes, at least up till this point, we definitely still do severe weather. So what our purpose is tonight, what we're going to try to get out of tonight's training. The first thing is we are going to talk spotter stuff because we are still looking at that component of actually intentionally relaying back what you see for the purpose of public safety. I want to be very clear that when we're talking spotters, this is not the same thing as chasers. So we're not talking about the guys that get a big juicy contract with some like Discovery Channel or something like that, and they're just out trying to get as close to that tornado as possible and maybe put something up in the tornado. Or we're talking about the folks that are local, a lot of times affiliated with our public safety agencies, but a lot of times general public that are relaying information back to help keep friends, neighbors, communities safe. So we're going to talk about how that has really morphed over the years, and it's not just select groups of people anymore. And we're going to talk about just education in general, about looking at a storm when it's ahead of you, or looking at a storm when you're watching it on radar, and trying to figure out what that storm is doing, what kind of hazards we have to worry about, and if you're in any kind of trouble, struggling with the speaking thing tonight. Is there anything that you need to do because you're either in the path or because something extremely hazardous like a tornado is developing? So we're going to start with the severe storm science, or the how the storms are put together first. And if you look at it kind of on a spectrum, there's about 4 different types of storms that you can have, varying levels of severity, varying levels of hazards. The very first one is your single cell storm, your pulse storm, or you can call it a popcorn storm. It's essentially those little storms, you might see them like in July, where it's a perfectly nice day and then suddenly, boop, there's a storm, and it just pops up and it does a little bit of mischief and then it dies. And maybe a few miles further down the line, it pops up again and then it dies again. And these things just kind of come and go. They don't live long enough to really get amped up to do anything substantial when it comes to wind, hail, tornadoes, that kind of thing. So they're not considered especially hazardous, especially concerning. So the overall threat on these is fairly low. But now if you get a bunch of them traveling together, they call that a multi-cell cluster. So you got a bunch of these little single cells and they all get together as a group and they start traveling together. And sometimes they can start to get strengthened up enough to maybe create some severe level hail, some severe level wind. But what we really worry about with these guys is if they start to develop a line of them and they just train over the same area over and over and over again. Here comes one, then another, then another, then another, over the exact same space. And what kind of problem do you suppose develops then? Flooding? Yeah. You get rainfall after rainfall after rainfall, and now what we're concerned about is an accumulation of too much rainfall, which is something we haven't seen for quite a while. Then we get into the ones that are those severe level storms, the ones that we're really starting to be concerned because they have the potential to create life safety hazards, property damage hazards. The first one is the squall line, which is that linear, long, as far as you can see, horizon to horizon type of storm. May stretch just across the state. It may stretch from Texas clear up to Michigan. But these are the long linear storms. And then the supercells are going to be that all concentrated, self-contained single ball of a storm that it wins out at the top end of the spectrum as having the most potential for the most hazards. And we're going to spend a lot more time talking about that one than the squall line, but we will go into a little depth on both of them. Regardless of what type of storm you're dealing with, there's 2 things in particular you want to know right off the bat. You want to know where stuff's going in, and you want to know where stuff's coming out. So your inflow area and your outflow area. Your inflow can be called your updraft. Your outflow can also be called your downdraft. But it's basically your inflow is where stuff is feeding the storm. So it's basically where that storm is bulking itself up, it's grabbing fuel, it's grabbing moisture, and it's getting itself cranked up. So that's where it's eating, essentially. That is the portion of the storm that you'll find as we go along that you most are concerned about your tornado threat. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that inflow or that updraft area. Then the other portion, the outflow, is where stuff comes out. And generally, aside from tornadoes, what comes out of a storm? What's kind of the Rain, hail, wind, that kind of thing. Yeah. So the stuff that comes out, or the outflow portion of the storm, that's where it's raining. That's where the hail is primarily occurring, maybe some gusty winds, that kind of thing. So that can be a separate area from inflow and outflow. And we'll talk about that here just in a second. But updraft, that's the portion of, oops, something went weird for a minute. That's the portion of the storm where it is feeding. Now, do we have anybody here that's a hot air balloon enthusiast, or has been on a hot air balloon, or has seen a hot air balloon? Okay, all right, finally we got somebody. So you know how you see people getting loaded on a hot air balloon, they're all climbing in the basket, you got this great big balloon inflated above it, and then somebody grabs the handle, they go do the, and then there's fire, and I think that's the technical term, it's, and then fire goes, and it heats up the air, and the balloon goes up in the air, right? So what's happening there is they're heating the air, which makes it buoyant, or makes it bouncy, and makes it rise, and that's what's happening when you're building a thunderstorm, especially when we're dealing with a supercell thunderstorm. But what's happening is you've got all this warm, moist air that just wants to bounce, it wants to go up because it's warmer than the air around it, and so it just starts rising. And you see it kind of bubbling and churning and growing. And that's where that storm is feeding itself. That is the storm fuel, is all that warm, moist air is bubbling and climbing and rising into the atmosphere. So looking specifically at the supercell, and we're going to talk most about this one because really supercells are the granddaddy of the storms. They have the potential to do it all. These guys can create intense amounts of rainfall. They can create very large, as you saw, apple-sized hail is possible. Very large hail. They can create extremely damaging thunderstorm wind gusts. And they can create tornadoes, but not just tornadoes. The supercell thunderstorm is the one that's capable of producing those high-end violent tornadoes. So that's why we spend the most time on these, because these are the ones that can be the most destructive, the most damaging, and the most likely to occur this time of year. This is kind of our prime season for supercells. So you look at about late March to about mid-June is really what's considered our storm season here, or our primary storm season. As you know, Mother Nature can produce tornadoes and storms in Kansas on mid-December and Christmas Day. But really, that is our peak time frame for really the primest environment and the best supercell fuel. So as we're trying to kind of figure these storms out, remember, we start with where is stuff going in? Where are we feeding the storm? And as you're looking at the supercell thunderstorm, you're looking at where is that core central portion of the storm where the thing is like bubbling and boiling and rising into the atmosphere. And as you're finding that kind of core central part of the storm, what you're doing is you're gauging how does it look? So if you look at the one on the far left, all soft and wispy, and it looks like somebody took some cotton and they just kind of stretched it a little bit. And it's just kind of got a pretty look to it, doesn't it? And then you look at the one on the right-hand side, and it's crisp and blocky and chunky, and it's got a lot more structure to it, a lot more form to it. It looks a lot like that head of cauliflower down in the corner of the screen, right? When you've got something that looks more like cauliflower than cotton, first of all, you've definitely found the updraft. And the second thing is you've found one that's substantial, that has a lot of power going up into it. And then eventually, as that updraft rises and rises and all that warm air is going up and the storm is bubbling and boiling and it's growing up into the atmosphere, eventually you're going to get a top to that storm. And as that storm tops out, it's going to start to sort of spread out, and you're going to get what's called an anvil, kind of that flattened pancake sort of top to the storm. You're also looking at what does that anvil look like at the very top of that updraft to tell you a little bit about how strong the updraft is and how strong the storm is. So again, if you find way up at the top of that storm and it's creating the anvil, and the anvil's just kind of wispy and cottony stretched, again, it's not a particularly overly strong storm, at least not at that point, especially compared to the one on the right, where that anvil looks a lot like the updraft in terms of it's chunky and it's crispy and it's got more of a cauliflower look. So that one on the right should right away make you kind of sit up and go, "Ooh, we're probably dealing with a pretty severe, pretty strong storm here." Now, what makes this time of year really special and what makes us capable of producing some really nasty storms, especially in that like late March to mid-June, is there's some things going on in the atmosphere here that don't necessarily always happen the rest of the year. So think back to that little pulse storm, and think back to that middle of July, and a storm just kind of pops and it's gone, and it pops and it's gone. When looking at the structure of those storms, a lot of times what's happening is that storm is just building, 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 building straight up in the air. So it's feeding itself. You got that updraft portion. And then stuff has to come out too, right? Because you have to have that downflow as well. So rain's coming down and hail's coming down and wind's coming down. And all this nice, warm, moist air is trying to go up, while all this cool rain, cool hail, cool wind is coming right back down in the exact same space that it's trying to feed. And as those two kind of collide with each other, essentially the storm short circuits. It just kills itself by just eventually wiping out that updraft, that fuel source. However, in the spring, we've got something different happening, because in the spring, we frequently have different wind speeds between that way lower level down toward the ground. And as you go up higher and higher and higher into the atmosphere, you can have increasing wind speeds. And wind pushes storms along. And you've got this big old updraft column that's building and building and growing, this big old supercell thunderstorm. And way down at the ground level, the storm's being shoved at about, say, 20 miles an hour. These are just kind of pick some numbers. 20 miles an hour, you get a little further up into the atmosphere, it's like 60 miles per hour. Way up here, like 30,000, 40,000 feet maybe, it's going 100 miles per hour. So with that column or that updraft getting pushed at different speeds, what happens is it actually starts to tilt. And so that top portion that's being pushed the fastest, it kind of starts leaning over. And so the storm's growing, 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 building itself up, but it's doing it at an angle. So when the rain and the hail and the wind comes out of it, it's coming out ahead of where the storm is feeding. And it creates a nice little self-contained, self-perpetuating cycle. And it just keeps feeding and dropping stuff and feeding and dropping stuff. And it can live a lot longer. So it doesn't short itself out. And the longer a storm can live, the bigger it can grow, and the bigger it gets, the meaner it gets, which means the bigger hail, the bigger tornadoes, the stronger wind speeds. So that's the kind of atmosphere that we have, especially in the spring, to make this possible. Well, then something else kind of happens this time of year as well, is sometimes not only are the winds at different speeds from lower to upper levels, they also can be at different directions. So if you start punching out that updraft column and hitting it not just with different speeds, but also from different directions, it not only knocks your updraft column over, it makes it start to do this. It rotates, just like the barbershop pole there. And so what you get is you get this massive, powerful updraft that's actually just kind of spinning like this. And if you were to stand underneath it, which absolutely is the position I don't want you in, but if you happen to look up like this, you would see that entire core portion of the storm just spinning above you. It's not a massive tornado about to drop. It's the entire body of the storm just cranking along like a top. And that also increases its power, increases its severity, increases its tornado potential. So as we're looking at these next few slides and the components of the storm, we're going to be looking at textbook examples, like when the storms follow all the rules and Mother Nature follows all the rules and puts in all the parts and pieces that we expect to see. So first we'll talk about the ideal storms, and then we'll talk about some that don't follow the rules. So remember, we're initially looking for where's the storm feeding. So where's that updraft? Where it flattens out, that anvil? And I will tell you that you need to be pretty far from the storm to find these. When you're initially looking at the storm, I'm hoping you're going to see it out in the distance, not that bent neck, like, oh, there it is, right above me. When you're about 30 to 40 miles away from a storm, ballparkish, you get a really good look at things like the updraft and things like the anvil. So that's when you can get that good view of, do I have cauliflower going on or do I have cotton going on? And remember, the more wispy it looks, we're looking at a weaker storm, the more crisp and chunky it looks, both in the updraft and in that anvil, that pancake on top, then we're dealing with that stronger, more severe storm. One thing that's really nice about that anvil is not only does it tell you kind of the power of the storm, But as that updraft is rising into the air, and then eventually kind of tops out because the temperatures kind of start to stabilize. It's no longer the warmest thing around, or the temperatures start to get about the same. And so it stops rising. And then, it's got to go somewhere. It's been rising. So it tips over and it creates that anvil. And because you've got wind that's pushing that storm along, what happens is as the top of that storm kind of tips over and makes the anvil just gets pushed forward in the direction the storm is going, which means that essentially the anvil becomes like a big finger going, I'm going that way. So you look at, like you see down in the corner picture there, whatever way the anvil is spreading should be the direction the storm is going. So right away you've got this visual. Is it going away from me? Is it going that way? And if it looks like it just kind of keeps sprawling and getting wider and wider and wider and wider, like that upper picture, that probably means it's coming straight at you. But it is a helpful little thing. Now, as you're dealing with a very powerful storm that's got a lot of power going up into it, sometimes not all of that anvil energy tips over and goes in the direction the storm is going. Sometimes it's just going with so much force that a little bit of that energy, that power, kicks back against the winds that are trying to push the storm along. And so you may get, if you look at that arrow is pointing to, you may get just a little lip off of the anvil that instead of going in the direction the storm is going, it kind of is hanging off the back end, almost like it's trying to go the other way. That little bit of extra anvil bit off the back is called a back-sheared anvil, a sign that you've got a very powerful storm. And sometimes, additionally, instead of all of it just topping out and making a nice, smooth top to your anvil, you can have little bits that start just kind of popping and bubbling like a big pat of butter sitting on your pancake. Again, there's so much force going into that storm that instead of all of it stopping, when it hits the level of the atmosphere where it's supposed to go any further, a little bit of it kind of pops up. So those are both clues that you're dealing with a storm that is extremely powerful, extremely severe, has the potential to create a lot of hazards. So what about looking at this thing on radar? Now, how many of you actually carry radar on or refer to radar on your phones, or watch it on TV, or look it up on the internet, or as storms are approaching? Most of you? Okay. So what you see with your eyes, most of those features you can actually find on a radar image as well. And what's happening with your basic radar image? This is called base reflectivity, that basic normal radar view that you see on your phone, that you see them flashing up on the TV during storms. What that view is basically the radar just shooting radar beams out, waiting for it to bounce off something and come back to the radar site. And the more of those beams that hit stuff and bounce back, the darker and more concentrated, or the brighter and more concentrated and bullseye looking it starts to appear on radar. And as you're impacting a storm with radar beams and more beams are bouncing back, what are they probably bouncing off of? In your normal run-of-the-mill storm. Probably rain, hail, all that stuff that's coming out of the storm. Yeah. So when you have a really dark concentration in the center like that, that's where the majority of your rain and hail is happening, because that's bouncing back most of the radar beams. But then you got a lot of other stuff that's happening on that radar image as well. I'm not sure if I got a pointer on this thing, do I? Well, if you look at the kind of more toward the right end of that radar image, you've got kind of a big sprawly area of lighter colors. It's lighter greens, lighter yellows, and it's like a big old sprawling area, right? That is actually where your anvil is sprawling out. So that kind of gives you that look of, oh, right, my anvil sprawls out and points the direction of my storm. So there's my anvil sprawling out ahead of my storm. Then I get a little further back to the left, and I got that really concentrated area of rain and hail. Okay, so that's my outflow area, or my downburst area, or downdraft area, where all the rain's coming out, the hail's coming out. And then behind that, remember in our classic supercell, it's feeding and dropping rain and hail, and it's feeding at an angle and dropping rain and hail. And it's actually doing that with the rain and hail out ahead and that feeding area behind. So we get behind that nice, bright, concentrated area, and you see how kind of tucked in behind it, in that little hook portion, there's a blank area where nothing's happening. You're not really bouncing any radar beams back. There's just that kind of empty space in the middle of that hook. That is the base of your updraft, because that's where it's doing all the feeding, and then it's dumping all the rain and hail out somewhere else. Now, this is a classic supercell, which means it has that beautiful little hook in it. And if you ever watch the TV meteorologist when severe weather's developing, and all of a sudden they start loosening the ties and talking a lot more earnestly, and they're like, oh, we have a hook echo on this storm. Well, the reason they're getting all excited is those hooks develop when you have a substantial amount of storm rotation. So you've got that big, monstrous supercell where that entire updraft column is spinning around, because that's pulling a little bit of that rain and hail around it, pulling a little bit of that other stuff for the beams to bounce off of, and creating that little hook sort of aperture, or whatever you want to call it, right there on the radar imagery. So that's kind of like a red flag to them that, oh, this storm's getting cranked up, this storm has a lot of potential. And the point where we're looking for tornadoes on a supercell thunderstorm is the base of that updraft column, or that area where you see nothing on radar inside that little hook. They sometimes refer to that as the bear cage as well. So they're seeing everything they need to see to tell them this is a big, classic, good old amped up supercell thunderstorm. So yeah, potential tornado location right there, and the area of very heavy rain. Now, if you're playing around with your radar app and you realize that it's got other things that you can switch around to, you may see that it says base reflectivity, or BR, and then you may see something called base velocity, or BV. If you switch to that view, it's still the radar doing its thing where it's shooting out the beams and bouncing beams back. But now, instead of just asking the question, the radar's not just asking, is there a lot of stuff out there that's bouncing back my beams? Now the radar's asking, what's that stuff doing when I hit it? Is it moving? Is it moving fast? Is it moving in what direction? So this is giving you wind information, because it's looking at how much that stuff is getting blown around. If it gives you a green color, it means whatever's out there is moving toward the radar. If it gives you a red color, it means it's moving away from the radar. And the brighter and more concentrated the colors are, the higher the wind speeds are. So you pull up your radar and you see really bright green right next to really bright red, which means going away from the radar, going to the radar, like right next to each other. And what motion do you suppose that's picking up on? Yeah, away, toward, away, toward, away, toward. That's where spinning is happening. Now, much of the time, it may just be picking up that entire massive rotating updraft column, saying, oh, that's just your storm rotating. But as you watch these get tighter and tighter and closer together, and you've got this really, really tight little ball of red next to a really tight little ball of green, and again, you see the TV meteorologists starting to get really, really excited, and they're wiping the sweat off their foreheads, going, oh, I got a bad situation here, because sometimes that can also indicate that there's a tornado at that location. That may be what they're picking up, the rotation. So the tighter that gets and the brighter that gets, they may use the term gate-to-gate shear. That's when they start to think, oh, have we crossed the line where it's not just storm rotation, but maybe now we're looking at tornado rotation. So that's a little thing you can use to kind of check on, or cross-check, am I in the dangerous part of the storm? Because unfortunately, storms do not always follow the rules, and they don't always have that classic structure. So if we look at the one on the left there, doesn't really look like that beautiful, perfect supercell with the hook echo and all that we were looking at earlier, correct? Now it's kind of, well, we got a blob, and there's some little notches here and there in the blob, but we don't really know what we're looking at. And so switching over to that base velocity view, if nothing else, at least you've found where the updraft is, or where that feeding area of the storm is, because now you're looking at, oh, here's the point of rotation, because there's my little red and my little green right next to each other. It may be, like I said, just the storm rotation. It may be something more ominous, but at least you know where to stay away from. So looking at these non-traditional storms, or non-perfect textbook storms, are there other things that we can look at on radar to tell us we're dealing with a dangerous storm? So one thing we can look at is something new the Weather Service added this year. You know, we've always been looking for that hook echo to figure out where our updraft area is. And now they said, if you can't find that hook echo, look for a kidney bean instead. Oh, that's a new one, isn't it? Look for the kidney bean. So if you see a storm that, as you're looking at kind of how it's appearing on radar, and it starts to look a little more like a kidney bean with that curve to it, what you want to look for is, you see in that middle where they've circled that portion of the bean, assume that that portion of the bean is where your updraft is. And that's where your tornado threat is. So that's one thing you can look for. Another thing you can look for, at least to cue you in how strong your updraft is you can look for something called a V-notch. Now, that image on the left may, and actually on the right as well, may just look at first glance like, oh, this is just a storm that's about to split. Because sometimes they do that. Sometimes they disagree and one part goes one way and one part goes another way. But these storms are actually traveling this way. They look just like a V and they just kind of are traveling along. And what's happening is, so you've got all those winds that are pushing the storm along. And normally what they do is they just shove the storm. But sometimes they go other places too. So they may, instead of just shoving that storm along, some of the winds may kind of break around that updraft, just like that stream is sort of breaking around that big boulder. So it creates that look on radar of a V because some of it's kind of just going around, that wind is going around that really big, massive, powerful updraft. So seeing that break in the storm or that V in the storm tells you you've got a big updraft column in that storm. Another thing you might look for is if you see that these storms all seem, especially the ones more to the right, all seem to be forming along that weird little kind of greenish blue line. Storms will frequently form along some kind of a boundary, whether it's a dry line, a cold front, some kind of features rolling through, and storms might start popping up anchored right along that line. So, as we're watching them start to pop along that line, you kind of expect them to stay in a line and keep just doing their thing all together as a group. But every once in a while, you'll have one, like if you watch the guy at the very tail end of that train, how he all of a sudden, rather than continuing up the line to the northeast, he almost looks like he's going straight east, doesn't he? That storm broke away from the crowd and took a right turn, and he's kind of doing his own thing. And it takes a lot of strength for a storm to break from the rest of the crowd, to be different from the other kids, and go a different direction. So when you see that guy turn away from the rest of them, that's a sign you're dealing with a very strong storm. So as we talked about earlier, that looking at the updraft, looking at the anvil, that overshooting top, that little dimple on the anvil, the back shoot anvil. Like I said, those are all things you're going to see from a distance away. So 30, 40 miles-ish, let's just ballpark it. As you're getting closer and closer to the storm, you're going to get to the point where you just can't see it anymore. You're just too close to the storm. So then you're going to start to zero in on other features of the storm to try to figure out, okay, what is this storm up to and where's the trouble portions? So now we're going to talk about, instead of the upper part of the updraft, we're going to talk about what's happening down underneath it and talk about some of these terms. So we found the feeding area of the storm. We found that updraft because we found that big, chunky, concentrated cauliflower portion of the storm. Except this one, instead of looking like cauliflower exactly, it looks like somebody took your birthday cake and took some fingers and just raked it along the side of your frosting. It just kind of made a mess of things. So you see kind of that stripy sort of look on the updraft. It is kind of sped up. They don't really quite move that fast. But you can see what's happening there is that is a sign of rotation. Those are called striations. When you see that striping in your big updraft column, that tells you that whole entire storm is spinning. So remember, spinning supercells, more powerful than, I guess, the one that's just sort of floating along. And because we've got that separation, so the updraft is rising at an angle and dropping rain and hail out in a different place, you should see a separation. And let me see if it's better in that first picture. This one's not the best. If you see off to the right how there's a little bit of gray, there's not a whole lot of rain coming out of this one, but off to the right, you should see a lot more gray. That should be where all the rain and hail is coming down. And then underneath the storm itself, where those arrows are pointing, underneath that updraft column, there's really not anything coming out of it, is there? It's nice and clear and no rain's coming. And because, meteorologists are pretty clever when they name things, there's no rain there, so they call that the rain-free base of the storm. So pretty clever, huh? So that rain-free base, that's the portion we're trying to find because that's where we have that risk of tornado development. So this gives you just kind of another shot of what a rain-free base might look like. You can see a little bit of striping on that, a little bit of rotation on it. This is another rain-free base at the bottom of an updraft column. I am told that after this picture was taken, that shed did not survive the experience. Apparently there was some big wind or something that came out of that one. And once we've located that rain-free base portion of the storm, the next thing we want to know is anything happening under it? Because yay, okay, we found the base, but now what? So we found the base or that feeding area of the storm. Now we're looking at, is there anything coming down? Obvious things would be a tornado. If there's a tornado coming out of it, woo, we got a tornado. But there are some things that can happen, some precursors before a tornado develops. And as we're looking for that, we're looking for lowerings, anything that's hanging down lower than the base of the storm. And these are what's called wall clouds. See, without all the cluster going on. Can you kind of make out there's a little bit of a chunkier block hanging down beneath the main portion of the storm? We'll get you a much better one here in a couple slides. This shows the formation of a wall cloud. You can see that a portion of that rain-free base is starting to drop lower than the rest of the storm. And you notice what else it's doing? Yeah, it's rotating. So not only are we forming a wall cloud, we're forming a rotating wall cloud, which is something that kind of gets us to that next step toward the potential of a tornado development. This is an example of an extremely well-formed, well-defined, very intentional wall cloud. That guy means to be there. When we're searching out the wall cloud, what we're looking for is something that is, you can definitely make out that it is lower than the rest of the storm. It is definitely still attached to the storm, though. You don't want to see daylight between that wall cloud and the base of the storm. If it's just something that's kind of hanging out separated from the base of the storm, there's an extremely technical term for what that is. Does anyone know? What, SLC? Have you ever heard of an SLC? Yeah, that is short for a scary looking cloud. Or I said, meteorologists really good at naming things. So a scary looking cloud is just kind of some junk that's hanging around underneath that base that's really not attached to the storm. It's just kind of hanging out, just some excess moisture. But if the thing that's hanging down is very solidly attached to that base of the storm, and it's hanging out for a while, it's not just well, it dipped for a minute, then it's gone. And it's getting lower and lower. You see this one seems to be practically touching the ground. And it's rotating. You get all those factors together, and all the hairs should stand up on the back of your neck and say, we're getting into being a very risky situation here. I would like to say that Mother Nature will always follow the rule of first you find the rain-free base, then something lowers and you create a wall cloud, then a little funnel forms, and then you get a tornado, and then it goes to a bigger tornado, so that you can always say, oh, we're now at stage 1.25 or 1B. It doesn't always happen in that order. Sometimes you just go straight from a storm to you have a tornado. But if you see one of these, if you see that really big wall cloud, and you see especially that it's hanging out and it's rotating, you have to have that high index of suspicion that a tornado could be next. This one, believe it or not, is actually real time. This is not sped up, and this is a good view of a rotating wall cloud. Sometimes it's a little harder to pick out that these things are actually spinning. So you might have to find something else in the scene or in your line of vision that you can watch as well as the cloud and say, does the cloud seem to be moving past that object? This one's a lot more obvious that we've got rotation going on. You guys gotta go. Bye, thanks for coming. So once you've found that wall cloud, and then maybe start to see a funnel develop, the next thing you're going to want to know is, okay, we're progressing from a wall cloud, we progressed to a funnel. Has that funnel touched down? Have we actually progressed to a tornado? I want to warn you, though, that when you have a very new tornado or a fresh tornado, it doesn't necessarily become instantly visible that we've gone all the way from the cloud to the ground. You may think that, well, okay, I think I pick out a wall cloud there. I think I've seen a funnel. Yeah, I think I see a funnel cloud developing there off kind of to the right, but it hasn't touched down yet because there's nothing filled in from top to the ground, is there? But what's happening right there at the ground? We have debris. Yeah, that's a young, early in its life cycle tornado, and it hasn't sucked up enough stuff into it yet. There's not enough dust and debris and other, condensation and stuff to actually fill in that entire cone or that entire portion of the tornado. So to look at that and go, wow, we got nothing on the ground yet, would be a wrong assumption. And actually, that's how the tornado that went here on the 29th started out as well. when in its early stages, so it touched down at about 8:10 p.m., about 2 miles into Sedgwick County. During those first initial couple minutes, there were actually several reports that came in from different areas that said, oh, okay, so we've got a funnel, and then somebody else said, now we've got a touchdown, and then somebody else is like, no, we got a funnel again, it appears to be pulling back up. No, the funnel's starting to drop again, and it was getting reported from a couple different locations, and this thing had eyes on it from everywhere, that it was still a funnel. But the thing was actually in contact with the ground. From the point of touchdown, it was in contact with the ground continuously. And what people couldn't necessarily see, because in this viewpoint, you can kind of make out just above the tree line, that little poof of stuff as it's moving along. But sometimes your vision is going to be blocked by other stuff in the scenery. It may be buildings, it may be trees, but it could be a fully formed tornado, and it just hasn't completely filled in yet. Because something to keep in mind, in its natural state, wind is invisible, isn't it? So that could very well, and at that point, that was a fully formed tornado. It just wasn't entirely visible yet. Other things that you can watch for, if you have that suspicion that I may not be dealing just with a funnel cloud, I can't see the point of impact, what else can I be watching for? Other things that you can watch for is as this thing crosses power lines, am I getting power flashes? So I see what I think is just a funnel. Oh, but there's this big explosion of sparks as it goes past the power line. Yeah, it's probably not just a funnel. Or if you're actually seeing debris dancing up around the funnel, that could be a sign as well that it's not just a funnel, as it's kind of launching some things up and it's just floating around the top of the storm. So textbook storm. We talked about the textbook storm, the one that follows all the rules and does all the things it's supposed to and has all the features that we're teaching you to look for. And then we have the storms that don't quite follow the rules. And one of those is a storm type that doesn't occur that often around here. It's the low precipitation supercell. So this is a storm that essentially does not have a lot of moisture in it. It's not producing heavy rainfall. It's not producing a lot of hail. As you can see from the picture, it has an updraft column. I mean, we can see that it has there's a rain-free base to it. It has a tilted updraft. So this is a supercell thunderstorm. But now look at the radar image. If you saw that on radar, would you give it a second thought? Like, woo, yay, there's a little bit of paint smear on my radar. So it doesn't really look like much. And the problem is when you don't have a lot of stuff in the storm in terms of moisture, there's not a lot to bounce the radar images back. So you get a false sense of security or a false message looking at the radar because you think, there's really nothing there. And then you look at it live and you're like, whoa, that's a pretty well-formed updraft. What's going on here? Normally, these things don't occur very often in our area. We don't have a lot more moisture in our atmosphere. You find these more like the Front Range over in Colorado. Air is a lot drier at the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. Not so much around here, except for maybe a night a year ago when we had this storm that went through Andover. And actually, those that saw the tornado, do you remember how much blue sky there was around that thing? A clear sky. Yeah, see, unfortunately, that one was a low precipitation supercell. So as it was passing through the city, you can see there was stuff that was bouncing radar images back. And you could see that, there's something on the radar. But do you remember some of the messaging that was starting to come across media as the storm cleared Wichita and it was clearing this area? And they're like, yeah, looks like we're done. Yeah, it looks like there's not much else being produced by this storm. And then all of a sudden, these funnel reports started coming in, and then tornado reports coming in. And what was really making the National Weather Service scratch their heads is because they're looking at the radar, and that is where the touchdown was being reported. And they're like, but, because it was a low precipitation supercell, it was not creating the radar signature to bounce back and say, here's where all this stuff is happening in this storm. So that was why there was such a big gap between the rest of what was going on in the storm and where the funnel started to develop and where the tornado developed. And we'll get more on that one later. So if we have on one end of the spectrum a low precipitation supercell, then kind of goes to assume that on the opposite end we have what's called a high precipitation supercell. Yeah, we do those. These are ones that have a tremendous amount of moisture in them. They are so full of moisture and so full of rain and hail and all that good wet stuff. And boy, are they bouncing back a lot of radar beams. And you can see a lot of stuff going on radar, but it may look like a really big angry blob. And what's the problem with these is, you know, we like to have that nice separation of here's the rain and hail, here's the clear area, so we can find the rain-free base, so we can find where we're expecting tornadoes to happen, so we can watch for things like wall clouds and funnels and tornadoes dropping. But with these high precipitation supercells, especially these big, monstrous rotating ones, there's so much moisture in them that as this big old thing is spinning, it starts to just drag some of that moisture around with its rotation. And now all of a sudden what you created is a big old rain curtain that's completely hiding the rain-free base. Our rain-free base is no longer rain-free. So we're looking at this thing going, okay, I found gray and more gray and what looks like the base of the storm, the big old updraft tower, but I just see more gray. So if you were looking at that, how could you tell if there's a wall cloud? How could you tell if there's a funnel or a tornado developing? Unfortunately, you couldn't visually because it's completely hidden. So you're hoping that you're smart enough not to drive into it, or that you have some other clues that you can look at in order to tell you if you're in trouble. We'll get to that. All right, remember back to that bent neck rule? We don't want to figure out where the core of the storm is, and we don't want to figure out the thing is rotating by looking and cranking our head back and looking above us. So hopefully we're not going to be that close when we figure out, hey, this is a rotating supercell. So let's say we do tangle with one of those great, big, monstrous, rotating, heavily moist supercell thunderstorms, those high precipitation supercells. You're looking at that, you're driving down that country road and you see a whole lot of gray and you think, it's all right, it's just rain, right? I can keep on driving into it. Except that as you're looking down on the lower left side, because you thought to switch to your base velocity view, you're like, I'm starting to see some points of increasing tight red and tight green. And maybe there's some rotation in this storm. Maybe it's the storm rotating itself, or maybe, like in this case, another big high precipitation supercell. So all we see is just a bunch of gray. Looks like just heavy rainfall, right? And the radar image just says, big blob of lots of heavy rainfall. And then you look down at your base velocity view and you see that really tight green and that really tight red right close to each other, signifying a lot of really tight rotation. And in this instance, in this case, there was a rain-wrapped tornado in that storm. Had you just kind of barreled into that thing because it's just rain, you would have found yourself tangling with a tornado. So those are things that we really want to avoid, those high precipitation supercells, just because they hide all the clues and they're so incredibly dangerous. So in terms of, do we need to worry, it says temperature warning on your projector, I think. So in terms of getting yourself prepared for tangling with these storms, what you really need to have, first and foremost, is you need to have a way to get information. So we don't want to have to just rely on the visual cues or just rely on, well, you know, it looks like it's okay, or I think I see things that tell me to stay away. It's really nice to be able to get some really exacting information of, are you in a warning area? Are you in an area that's today is prone to very severe weather? Getting that in-the-minute information, you can definitely go out and purchase and subscribe to things. Apps, for example, for radars, there's some great radar apps out there. Or you can do something as simple as just going out to one of the 3 TV stations, whichever one you happen to be a patron of. And though all 3 of them have notification services that you can sign up for. So just say, I want to get your text alerts or your notification alerts. And you can get the watches and the warnings to your phone based on the information they put out. They also have radars as well that you can reference in addition, that's no cost to you. But if you want to do something a little fancier, something a little more expensive, go out and Google and see kind of what tickles your fancy. One recommendation is that if you do have a radar app on your phone, is that you have your location services enabled, and hopefully the app gives you a way to turn on your dot where you're at. When this is incredibly important is especially when you're in an area you're not familiar with. Because right now, if a storm came out and they're like, hey, it's currently headed toward Andover and the storm is just east of the city or it's just west of the city and it's coming across this road, you guys know the area. You're familiar with the landmarks. If they say Butler County is warned, you don't say Butler what? But imagine you're traveling. You're down in Oklahoma, for example, and all of a sudden your storm alerts go off in your phone and it says a tornado warning has been issued for Alfalfa County and this tornado is currently crossing by the intersection of K and X. And you have absolutely no idea what any of that means. And you pull up your radar app and you're like, yeah, oh, there's definitely a really big storm. I have no idea where I am in relation to this storm. However, if you have your little GPS dot enabled, you turn that thing on and you can go, oh, I'm here, the storm's here, I'm in great shape. Or flip side, I'm here, the storm is here, I'm in trouble. But that can be a very helpful thing to, especially when you're not in a familiar area. Now, in terms of if you're out and about and tangling with a storm, especially if you're intending to be there because you want to be a spotter, you want to relay information, there are some things you need to keep in mind when you're getting yourself positioned, or even when you're just trying to get away from a storm, about where the safest places to be are around a supercell. I think it's probably pretty obvious you don't want to be in front of it, because the thing's like moving straight toward you and you're gonna get it all. The rain, the hail, the wind, possibly the tornado. So definitely being directly in the path is not a good thing. You also don't want to be in that area. You see, this is the classic one with the hook echo. You don't want to be in that area where you have the base of the updraft and the potential for tornadoes. So we definitely want to stay away from that too. I think, did I already tell you they use the term the bear cage for that? Yeah, stay away from the bear cage. We don't want to be there either. This little guy, and you see the arrows, it's pointing to ways of an escape route. So the storm, because your anvil's spreading off to the northeast, and then you got your heavy rain and hail, and then you got your little hook echo, and you got your portion where the updraft column is, that whole thing is moving away from him. So our little happy guy, he's like, I got a lot of options to get out of here. If I was going to recommend at all trying to outrun a storm, the only time that I would recommend trying to outrun a storm is if you know for sure where you're at, you know for sure where the storm's at and what direction it's heading, and you know that the route you've chosen definitely goes where you think it goes. Because if you're in an unfamiliar territory and you assume that every road always goes through, like north-south roads always go through without any break in them, right? I mean, every road in Butler County never has any surprises where suddenly the road ends, right? So if you're trying to outrun a storm and you're like, yeah, I'm going to take this road because I'm pretty sure that the storm's going this way and I can go this way, and you're running from the storm, and the next thing you know, this road, which you thought was going to go straight, takes a very sharp right angle and pops you right into the path of the storm. So outrunning a storm can be extremely dangerous when you don't know where you are, what your road's going to do, or what the storm's doing. So at night as well, if you don't have radar with you and you're just trying to gauge on where you see the lightning flashing, outrunning a storm is even more dangerous at night because who knows what that thing is up to. Now, some other kind of pointers if you were going to stage yourself around a storm for the purposes of spotting a storm. So there's our classic supercell, you know, the one that follows all the textbook rules. And then we'll kind of change it to the more animated, not animated, but sketched out version. So we know too close, the big red thing, the bear cage. Even if you're spotting, if you're there because you're trying to get information, that's never a good time to be too close as well. So we can get good information from a distance. So never in the bear cage, never directly in the storm's path. If you're on that top side of the storm where it says view is blocked by precipitation, if you're looking through the rain and hail, that really doesn't give you a whole lot of visibility. You're not going to really make out what's going on under the rain-free base. So that's not a good spot either, being on that far side of the storm. However, being on the back side of the storm can cause some problems too. If you're directly behind it, going the same angle as the storm, there can be something, and we're just going to use this term once just so you hear it. There can be something called an RFD, or a rear flank downdraft, coming off the back end of the storm, which essentially, remember, all those winds are pushing the storm along, they're shoving your updraft along, and most of the time they push, sometimes they split and make the V-notch, but sometimes some of those winds will hit that updraft column and they'll just slide straight down the back of it, like a kid on a playground slide, just plunge down the back of the storm and plunge very rapidly to the ground and onto whoever happens to be behind. So just be aware you may find some very strong winds right at the very back of that updraft column and that rain-free base. So not a good place to be either. That best area to be, what's really nice about that, so the storm is progressing with the rain to your right, the rain-free base to your left, so you know it's moving past you. What's really great about that angle, looking into the bear cage, is that as you're staring at that rain-free base and kind of looking more toward the back of the storm, what you should have behind that should be clear skies. And that's really nice because that's a great backdrop if a tornado drops, because now you've got gray against clear skies. You get rotated the other direction, like where that RFD is, and you're looking through. Oh, okay. You're looking at the rain and hail ahead of you, so you've got a gray backdrop and a gray tornado dropping, and they tend to just kind of obscure each other. All right, we'll let. Oops. hang on for a moment of technical difficulty. We'll let the tech guy reboot us. All right, so we're just taking the one down? Okay. All right, and we're still good back on your video too? Okay, so continuing on, get to where I'm not blocking everybody's view. So looking at what we're going to do for the next few slides is we're going to look at some examples of live view compared to our radar view. Try to pick out some of the things that we've been talking about and see what you're able to make out. Now, on this storm, not 100% textbook radar imagery. I mean, you do kind of have the look of the anvil sprawling out, your more concentrated area of rain and hail. Maybe, would you say maybe a hook echo there? You kind of buy that? Yeah, a little bit. So you're making out an area that tells you, well, it does look like there's maybe a well-formed supercell. If there's a bit of a hook, probably getting more cranked up, probably a tornado potential. And what do you see off to the left? Yeah, we definitely see a fault. Can you make out from where you're at if it's actually in contact with the ground? No. So that's one of those where our view is blocked, but we've definitely found the danger part of the storm, and it does look like it's doing something. All right, this one, would you all agree that that's an updraft? The feeding area of the storm? Does it look like a pretty well-formed one? And can you kind of see an angle to it? Look like it's a tilted updraft? Yeah, this one, you don't see a whole lot of gray off to the side. So I'm not seeing a whole lot of rain and hail, but I think we definitely can say we found the rain-free base area. And then underneath it, do you see anything that's calling your attention? Maybe a little bit of lowering, a little bit of a wall cloud. Does it maybe even look like a little dimple of a funnel there? Possibly. Anything else that you see on the structure of that storm over there on the radar side? Maybe a little bit of a V maybe. So kind of weigh on how powerful that updraft looks in the live picture. But if it's strong enough to create a V, it's probably a pretty cranked up supercell. Okay, what features can you see over on the left there in that picture? Yeah, you got a definite distinction between the gray of the rain and then the rain-free area. What's going on that rain or on that cyclone or that updraft? Striations, yeah. So that thing's rotating, isn't it? And then on the radar image, what do you see on that radar? Yeah, we have a kidney bean. So the portion of that storm is kind of in the notch portion of the bean that we need to be worried about, right? That should be where our rain-free base is. Seen anything in terms of like wall clouds or anything like that under it? Maybe a big wall cloud there. Kind of have to keep an eye on that to see if that lowers a bit more, starts to get some spin on it. Okay. How about this one? What do you see on this guy? Do we have an updraft? A tilted updraft? Yeah. Do we have anything underneath the rain-free base area? Possibly a little wall cloud? What do you kind of notice though, looking at that picture itself and then looking at how it appears on radar as well? What kind of supercell might this be? Low precipitation? Yeah, because there's a whole lot of kind of bright, clear sky around this thing and not a lot of structure on radar. It's just like, boom, here's a blob. Okay. What about on this one? What do you see on the radar image? Very pronounced V notch on this one. So we're going to guess probably a pretty powerful updraft. Rest of it, it's kind of hard to make out what's going on. You just see the gray underneath it from the rain and maybe some lowering. Okay, this guy is in one of those positions where he's sort of on the back and a little off to the not so good visibility side. And as you can see, he's got a great view of the updraft. Good cauliflower look, isn't it? So he sees the back of the updraft. So you can definitely see it's a big, old, crisp, massive updraft. Underneath, you just sort of see gray and more gray, right? So might give him a good view of the updraft, but he can't really report on anything else. This one's included just so you can see, this is an example of a storm that is actually splitting. As opposed to a V, you can see these two are actually breaking apart, becoming two distinct storms. A lot of times when you have that happen, one big supercell, and then after a while, it starts to not get along with itself, so it splits into two supercells. As those separate from each other, a lot of times one of them will become dominant and it'll just sort of suck all of the energy and all the fuel to itself. So it may be that one of them will just kind of fiddle off and die and the other one becomes the big dominant monster storm. Okay. So when we're talking about protective actions or what you need to do if you're faced with one of these storms, when it comes to sheltering, so if you've got a big massive supercell coming toward you, especially one that's tornado warned, the best advice for sheltering is still, if you have access to below ground sheltering, basement, storm cellar, or something like that, that should be your first choice. Equally, if you have if you install an actual above ground FEMA rated storm shelter, you can treat that the same as the below ground shelter. But that is our first choice, is to get below ground. Second choice, if you happen to be in a well-built, stick-built home, then those often will ride out most if not all of the low-end tornadoes. If you get as low as possible and as interior as possible. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to get as many walls between you and the storm, get away from windows, and get into something tight and cozy. So if you have an interior bathroom with no windows, you're far from the outside, you've got an interior closet, getting kind of in there and getting hunkered down on that lower level. Because the majority of our tornadoes that we get, so that like the EF3 we experienced last year, that's kind of an oddity. Most of our tornadoes are EF0, EF1, EF2, and the big, violent, monster ones, EF4s and EF5s, are even more rare. They're typically like 5% or less of the storms. And so since the majority of what we get is those low-end storms, they may take off a roof, they may tilt or peel off an outside wall, but a lot of them cannot get all the way to the center of a home. So for the majority of our tornadoes that happen, getting to that lower level as interior as possible in a well-built home is a sheltering option. Now, if you're in a mobile home or a modular home and that the tin shed, work building out behind your property, your plan should be to abandon those. So give yourself a lot of lead time. Make sure you have good information so that you can get to another shelter location rather than riding it out in that building. Now, let's say instead you were out on the road. You weren't home or you weren't in a building where you could take shelter. Your last choice should be to actually ride it out in your car. Meteorologists will all agree, tornadoes and cars just don't mix very well at all. And so if you're out driving and you know you're in the path of a tornado-warned storm, if you know of a location where you can actually shelter in a building, you're near a business, you're near a friend's house, you have a way to get into a shelter inside, take that as your first choice. One other really bad, like not on your list choice, is highway overpasses or getting underneath the highway overpass. I know years and years ago, there used to be some mythology out there that said, oh, those are great places to ride out a tornado. Not so much. What essentially happens with those overpasses is all that wind power gets concentrated and just kind of wind tunnels underneath that bridge, concentrates, and not only does it just blast through on top of you, it also, all the debris and stuff it's carrying just kind of starts pelting you. So yeah, that's a bad option too. So stay out from under the overpasses. We're still kind of in that back and forth of, okay, so you don't have any towards you. Get out, stay in. So some meteorologists will say, if you can find a low-lying area, like a ditch or something that you can lie down on and get as low as possible, as flat as possible, abandon your car and do that. Well, if we specialize in storms that have a lot of rain in them, that ditch can fill up pretty quickly, and now you got a whole new problem. So yeah, that's kind of a roll of the dice. If you are going to ride it out in your vehicle, though, the recommendation is that you buckle in, and you get as low as possible so you're not face first into any glass that shatters. Because yeah, if you recall that, especially when you get into that high EF3 end, that just, yeah, cars and storms not entangling so well. Do we have any questions about supercells at this point? We're going to talk about squall lines and other form of severe storms, but we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on them because there's really not a lot to talk about with them. They're just not quite as, I don't want to say not quite as exciting as a supercell, but not quite as many parts and pieces and mechanics to them. Your squall line, now that is your horizon to horizon, that long linear storm, just kind of barreling along, big old, maybe statewide, maybe like across the entire nation type of storm. But what is notable about this, the feature you often notice first with these storms, is that you see what's coming toward you in that picture is the shelf cloud, or this big, well, basically shelf-looking thing that's just marching toward you at the front end of that storm. What's interesting is that shelf cloud actually represents your updraft. It represents where this type of storm is feeding itself. So almost pretty much in a complete flip-flop, a reversal from what our supercell did, where it's feeding itself on that back end and then it's throwing all that rain and hail out ahead of it, the squall line is feeding itself at the front. It's basically acting like this big, massive snowplow of a storm. So it's barreling along, you have the big old shelf cloud, and what it's doing is it's pushing out these big, strong gusts of cool wind. So those are diving down toward the ground and acting like a big old scoop. So that'll plunge to the ground, and then all the warm, moist air that it's feeding on just gets scooped right up the front side of the storm. And that kind of sculpts that front edge of it and creates that shelf cloud sort of feature. So that is where it's feeding. So it feeds itself, and then you get, you know, all the other stuff that comes with it. So it is really, it's a complete backwards to your supercell thunderstorm. Feeding first with a squall line, and then you get all the rain and stuff. Supercell, rain and stuff, and then the feeding area. So a squall line thunderstorm, it can do hail, sometimes a little larger hail, usually not your baseball-sized hail and your apple-sized hail and that kind of thing. It can do heavy rainfall. It also can do tornadoes, but it does not have the structure to do the big violent tornadoes. So you will not find EF4s, EF5s with a squall line. You can find zeros and ones for sure. Sometimes we creep up a little higher in the twos, 2+, but they're just not structured right to do really big tornadoes. What squall lines do really, really well is they do wind. These guys specialize in extremely strong straight line winds. So that is usually the biggest hazard we're concerned about with these. Of course, if you're doing a really strong straight line wind, and let's say it's only producing quarter-size hail, but you're pushing that miles an hour, it may not create really big hail, but that hail is going to hurt, isn't it? So just kind of keep that in mind, those pair together. One thing in particular that we're watching for with squall lines is, actually, first I want to point out something on the shelf cloud. Do you see how that shelf cloud has kind of a very defined, almost like a ribbon of bacon area? That sculpted area at the top that's very, very nicely sculpted, essentially. Nice ribbony sort of look. And then below it, it has a very low hanging, very fluffy skirt. That combination of things there gives you a clue that you're dealing with a severe squall line. If it has just kind of a scraggly ragtag shelf cloud out ahead of it that's not very well formed, and it doesn't have that really smooth and sculpted and skirty sort of look, probably not one of the severe end type of squall lines. So structurally look for that. But additionally, what we really want to watch out for is when these squall lines, instead of staying straight, start to take on a curve to them, start to create what's called a bow echo. When they start to curve like that one showing there on radar, what's happening is wind speeds are increasing. And wind speeds are increasing specifically at the point that's starting to pooch out at the front of the storm. So that has suddenly become the fastest portion of the storm. So maybe at the outer edges of it, the top and the bottom of the storm, maybe it's creating 50-mile-per-hour severe thunderstorm wind gusts. But maybe at the bow portion of the storm, it's producing 70, 80, 90-mile-per-hour wind gusts. These kind of storms can also produce those 100-plus. You heard the term derecho. Yeah, these really, really strong straight line wind storms. So yeah, these can definitely create 100-plus mile-per-hour straight line winds. And especially you're watching for that bow echo portion of the storm. If, on that tornado note, if you are going to have a tornado form with a squall line, where it's going to be is it's going to be dancing along that front edge of the storm. So in that intersection area where we're blasting out the cold air and we're sucking up all that warm moisture, just scooping up all that fuel, in that front edge of the storm, sometimes with all that other chaos going on, we can actually spin up some tornadoes right there on the front end. Now, because we're not dealing with the same kind of structure like you are with a supercell, where you have a somewhat more predictable, okay, here's the rain-free base, we got a wall cloud, we got a funnel cloud, now we got a tornado. Unfortunately, with the squall lines, if they spin these things up, they can spin them up rather abruptly, which means the lead time of going, oh, I think we have a tornado, oh, we have a tornado warning, sometimes happens in an order that we don't necessarily like. It's like, oh, bam, it's on the ground, and now we have a warning, because they're very hard for the Weather Service to predict. So there's a lot more of the kind of, oops, here's a tornado that happens with the squall lines. Even more likely to happen at the point of the bow. So you got to really watch out from there. But if you're going to have a tornado with a squall line, just be aware you might not get a lot of warning time. It's just suddenly, bonk, it's there. So it does kind of, I think, frustrate the Weather Service a little bit. As you're looking for that bow, it becomes fairly obvious on radar, but you actually can sometimes see it visually as well. It may look like that whole leading edge or that whole shelf cloud portion of the storm is curving. So when you're looking for, or when you're watching for that portion of the storm, your biggest goal should be stay away from the bow portion of the storm. If you're going to be anywhere entangling with that storm, stay away from the bow. Another thing that we kind of get slotted in here, just so you're aware of it and so that we've talked about it, is this lovely thing called the microburst. Anybody ever gotten the pleasure of tangling with a microburst before? So folks that have had a microburst go through, that have done damage to their property, or have heard them go through or seen them go through, will oftentimes report them as a tornado. They will swear up and down, my house got hit by a tornado last night. I mean, look at that. The debris is everywhere like this. It's not like all thrown to the west or all thrown to the east. It's like everywhere. Well, here's the thing with the microbursts. Microbursts are straight line wind, but instead of straight line winds going this direction, it's straight line winds coming from the storm and plunging to the ground. As you can see in that kind of sped up picture there, it's just diving straight down out of the storm. And when it plunks right on top of your house, yeah, it does kind of sort of scatter things in every direction. But it is, and I hate to use the term just straight line wind, because that straight line wind is just as damaging as tornadoes. It is straight line winds. And one of the things you can watch for is as these are plunging to the ground, they hit the ground a lot of times with so much force that it'll create a little bit of a kick up when it hits the ground. So you can kind of see along there where it creates what they call either a rain foot or a dust foot, depending on if there's moisture in it or not. If it's just wind coming down and it kicks up dust when it hits the ground, they call it a dust foot. And that little curve there. If there's a whole lot of rain coming down as well, and causes both rain and dust to kick up, they'll call it a rain foot. But they make a lot of noise. They can potentially sound like a tornado as they're roaring down. And in terms of when to watch out for them, so they can occur anytime in a storm's life cycle, but they are most likely as the storm is aging and decaying and dying, because it's been like wafting all of this warm, moist air, and it's been working so hard to build this big updraft and build this big, powerful storm, and the storm gets older and older, and it gets tired, and then it starts to kind of go and drop some of that wind and some of that energy out of it. And unfortunately, sometimes it's over your house, your chicken coop, your fence, your trees, and boom, there they go. Any question about squall lines before we go into the safety portion? Okay. If you are dealing with a squall line, if this thing is stretching from Texas to Michigan, you're not going to avoid it, so there's no such thing as, well, I'll just go down this road another mile and turn south, and then I'll be fine. If you're on the road, you're not going to get away from it. So that's one thing is, if a squall line's coming for you, a squall line's coming for you. You're going to impact it. Best thing you can do is try to at least be away from the bow portion of the storm. When you're at home and you hear that a powerful squall line or a powerful severe thunderstorm is coming your way, you're looking on radar and you're going, it's a squall line. I don't have to worry. They don't really produce tornadoes very often. It's not a big deal. It's just going to be some wind and hail and stuff. Remember, though, these can produce 70, 80, 90, 100 mile per hour winds, potentially. So if you hear that severe thunderstorm warning come out and they're talking those kind of wind speeds, what we recommend is treat it when it comes to sheltering like you would a tornado. Get away from those windows, get away from those exterior walls, get as interior as possible. Below ground is great until that storm passes over, because if it produces a 90 mile per hour wind gust coming through, that can do some damage. Road-wise, though, if you're on the road, like I said, you're not going to outrun this thing, and you definitely don't want to end up like that guy up there with the trailer that rolled over. Best bet is, if at all possible, and that storm is rolling towards you, get positioned so that your vehicle is pointed straight at the storm, if at all possible. It gets you become a little more aerodynamic, as that all the wind just kind of washes over the front of your hood and over the top of your car. But also, if there is a lot of wind-driven hail and that kind of thing in it, your windshield's a little more reinforced than your other windows, and so you got a little added protection as that stuff's like pelting your car. I've added this slide because I did want you to be aware of a change that's happened to the wireless emergency alerts. Have you all heard the term wireless emergency alerts, or WEAs, before? It's the thing like when an Amber Alert is issued, all of a sudden your phone starts squeaking and squawking, and it's like, Amber Alert has been issued for. So it is a project at the federal level, a nationwide project that a bunch of alphabets got together, like the FCC and FEMA and NWS, and developed this system that is supposed to be automatically installed on all smartphones, and you don't have to subscribe to it, and you don't have to turn it on. As soon as you buy your phone, it automatically is enabled. And it's a way to try to get the most urgent life safety information out to as many people as possible without having them to actually subscribe to something. So as they were developing these systems, and they're trying to decide what goes in it, they're like Amber Alerts, okay, that's kind of a given. Presidential alerts, which I don't know if it's ever been used for, yeah, they put those in there. Then they're thinking about, what do we do for weather? It's a great way to reach people for weather, but how much do we put in there? Well, tornadoes were kind of a given. Absolutely, we want to put tornadoes in there. And because that's, if a tornado warning is issued, we're talking life safety. We're talking severe threat to life and property. So that was a given for our area. The other one, they said, well, let's put flash flood warnings in there because, potentially we're talking some pretty severe life safety type. Let's learn on that as well. For our area, tornadoes and flash floods are what was put in there. They opted not initially to put severe thunderstorm warnings in there. Think back to state of Kansas, typically 1,200 different warnings issued a year. If your WIA alert went off for every storm that was warned for quarter-sized hail or 58-mile-per-hour wind gusts, there are ways to shut WIAs off. Would you be shut? They were afraid a lot of people would be doing that. So they left severe thunderstorm warnings out entirely initially. They did some thinking and some reevaluating, and last year they made an update. And they have severe thunderstorm warnings in there for WIA alerts if they have either a warning for 80-mile-per-hour winds or greater, or baseball-sized hail or larger, or both. So you may get a WIA alert going forward for a severe thunderstorm warning, which you wouldn't have previously. Hey, come on, go. Okay, so I told you that at one point we were going to talk about kind of how things came together and what, meteorologically and weather conditions and information-wise was all happening as that storm was developing on the 29th. So first of all, one of the things that was notable about that is that Weather Service had already started talking about a potential for severe weather. Now they'd been messaging that it was conditional. They said may or may not be triggered. But if that spark happens, if storms are triggered, it will have the potential to be high end, so significant severe weather. So it's just all kind of that balancing act of if it happens or not, if that trigger happens. So this was issued April 28th, so the day before, and you can see they were outlining kind of the bullseye of the highest area, and they were warning for very large damaging winds of 60 or 70 miles per hour or greater, and they were saying, you know what? If these storms develop, yes, they will have the potential for tornadoes, and they will be the potential for higher end tornadoes, EF2 or larger. So this was already in their minds going into the 29th. Who's familiar with the Storm Prediction Center? You've heard of that before? So the National Weather Service office in Wichita does our local forecasting. So what is going to happen in our area? They also issue warnings for our area. There is a group, part of the Weather Service family, called the Storm Prediction Center down in Norman, Oklahoma. And one of their taskings is to watch the entire United States and draw the bullseye. Where are the severe weather bullseyes going to be? And they are actually the ones that issue the watches. Since that's kind of a bigger area, they'll say, well, this entire block of Kansas is going to be under a watch. So that comes out of their office. So this was one of the early lead up bullseyes that they drew for the 29th. And they said, okay, yes, there's going to be severe weather potential. You see their scale goes from a very light green, which means garden variety thunderstorms. The next is darker green, which is marginal. Yellow is slight, which the next step up from that is orange is enhanced. Red is moderate. And then the very peak, the pinnacle you can hit is this kind of pinkish color, which is a high. So initially it looked like this. Then they did an update and said, whoa, I think our bullseye looks a little more like this. And they expanded this area substantially. And they also drew a moderate risk area, which interestingly enough was not over us. You see, it was kind of more like the Lawrence, Topeka, that kind of area. Well, one of the things that the Storm Prediction Center does, in addition to saying where is the bullseye, is they look at specific hazards and say, okay, where is the highest percentage of hail chances or damaging wind chances or tornado chances? They'll actually have a separate map or separate graphic for each of those. So this happened to be the tornado outlook for that day. And I know if you can see the numbers, the most had a 15% probability. And if you do the math, you might think, 15%, that's not that bad. That's like an 85% chance that nothing will happen. Well, meteorologists do slightly different math, and to them, like 15%, that's really elevated. And so to them, when they put like a 10% and then a 15%, you're talking that your risk is ramping up exponentially. Now, I've seen it as high as like 40%. We definitely don't want to be in there. But that meant a significant tornado risk. What you also might notice is there's some black hatch marks over it. Do you see that? So their colors indicate probability. So we were in a 10% probability area, but we were also in a hatch marked area. And when they put the hatch marks on, what they are signifying is not only were we in a 10% probability area, but because of the hatch marks, it meant If it developed, we were looking at the high end. So we had a 10% probability of not just tornadoes, but EF2 or greater. So Storm Prediction Center down in Norman was also saying, environment's looking a little dicey. This is kind of a follow-up after the fact. This is where they overlaid their storm reports over top of the actual bullseye they had drawn and said, well, how close did it prove out? And you can see pretty much most of the reports that came in for wind, hail, tornado, all that did actually materialize in pretty much the central part of the bullseye. The bad days that they don't like is when the clustering is all like way outside of the bullseye. That doesn't look so good for them. All right, you remember that picture? So low precipitation supercell. A storm had developed up, was passing through the area, and then way where the radar says nothing is happening, now suddenly we got something happening. So this is 6:45 p.m. You remember when everything that happened was just after 8 o'clock. So 6:45 p.m., this is well in advance of the actual storm itself. But you can see that these storms, there's a lot of blue sky around them, isn't there? You've got some structure, you have an updraft, it's tilted, you got a rain-free base, but you also got a rain-free everything else. So there's not a lot of moisture. And looking at it on radar, there's really nothing to look at all on these. So what the National Weather Service was expecting to happen that night is we had a couple of features moving in. We had a dry line coming in and we had a cold front coming in. And as those were converging on the area, what they figured would happen was storms would start up to our northeast, and then they'd call what they call zippering, zipper down the line. They just start filling in and those boundaries there. Actually, you're getting that little scattering of just scuddy little scattered little storms developing. And here's the comparison, that 6:45 image. 30 minutes later, you're still seeing storms that have a supercell structure, and there's just not moisture happening around them. Come on, you go. All right, so finally something starts happening. So this was 7:30, just after 7:30. Finally, the line starts to develop up enough that they're hitting severe criteria. So they start popping all along the line, start popping severe thunderstorm warnings. And initially, they were just warned for wind and hail. So like, okay, we're going to have some severe level wind, we're going to have severe level hail. And about, I'd say 10 minutes later, they revised the language of the warning, and they added a little line, they call it a tag that they're able to insert, that said, tornadoes possible. So we hadn't gotten to the point where they thought, okay, we need to progress to tornado warnings, but they were starting to, that little seed was being planted, that the environment is there. Then the moment came where they had to make a decision, because they were getting spotter reports coming in of funnels, and they were getting spotter reports of all this activity happening. One thing in particular that was notable is they were getting reports of shear funnels, which are the ones that it looks like a little bit of spaghetti that's going the wrong, it's going horizontally rather than vertically, which is another sign of a rapidly developing tornadic environment. And they're like, oh, got a problem here. We've got to figure out whether or not to warn on this storm. And so when they're making a warning decision, they're looking at three factors. They basically call it three legs of their stool. First of all, they're looking at the environment. Is this even an environment that's conducive to tornadoes? Because if the fuel is not there, if the conditions are not right, and people are saying, oh yeah, it's where I saw a tornado. Yep, I saw a tornado. Maybe it's a little dust devil, maybe it's a land spout. But if the environment's not there, then they check that one off. However, in our case, they knew the environment was there. They've been saying all along, if this thing lights off, the potential will be there to go really bad. So they knew they had the environment. The next thing they look at is, do we see the radar activity? Do we see what we expect, that rotation? Do we see that structure of the storm on radar? They didn't have it. There was nothing on radar to really tell them, yeah, we had a big problem developing. So then the third thing they look at is, what are spotters reporting? What are our trusted spotters reporting? Because you can get a variety of information. We've had tornadoes reported on clear days, but when they start hearing from trusted sources, people that are directly affiliated as spotters with the National Weather Service, or with a TV station, or with a public safety agency of some kind, like fire, law, EMS, like, Ooh, we just checked off the third box. We've got the correct environment and we've got the spotter reports. So they issued that tornado warning basically blind. They were taking it on faith that, okay, this is a situation that requires a tornado warning. When all of this coordination is happening, all of these decisions are trying to be made and spotter traffic is flowing back and forth, one of the places where it happens is there's a chat room that we're in called NWS Chat. And in it, you've got the National Weather Service, you've got the emergency managers, you got some of the 911 centers are in there. Spotters, some spotters, media affiliated spotters are in there. The media stations themselves are in there. And it's this whole room where all these conversations are going. And we're pumping in information like, well, our spotters are seeing this. Well, our spotters are seeing this. And NWS is firing back and saying, well, this is what we're seeing in the environment now. So it's this whole conversation happening. And as we were going to that point of warning decision, so it's just a snapshot of some of the spotter reports of some of the traffic that was happening. In particular, they pulled out a few of them. A funnel report that was witnessed from Greenwich. So everybody was seeing it from everywhere, honestly, because it was so visible. The one chaser for KWCH that was just north of Rose Hill was reporting Live's funnel. He's sitting in southern Butler County, reported his location at just north of Rose Hill. Developing funnel cloud, he also reported that one as well, I believe. And then this one came from you guys, passed through us. A spotter in Andover reporting a funnel cloud. We relayed that onto them right away. That's all 8:09 p.m. And so 8:10, touchdown was reported, and the tornado warning pretty much happened simultaneously. And in those moments too, Chief Buchanan happened to look out the door and go, ah, and was also requesting that the sirens be sounded in the city right before that warning was issued, correct? You beat it by just a brief amount of time. So yeah, good job, Chief, right? Where's our sounder? Yay, thank you very much. So all that stuff is happening simultaneously. All right, so as this thing's touching down, as it's starting to move, more reports are coming in. We've got confirmation from that same spotter for KWCH going, okay, now it's on the ground, and he's given his location. He's the tornado's 3 southwest of Andover. We got fire reports from Sedgwick County watching it. They're saying they're seeing debris. And then bottom, I don't know how well you can make that out. We were relaying in reports from our spotters saying rope tornado on the ground just south of Andover at the county line. This is like 3 minutes later, it's approaching the county line already. And to give you an idea of how important that information is that's being relayed, so as we're pumping information to them that you guys were giving to us, so here's an example. At 8:13, we're reporting several spotter reports of a rope tornado on the ground just south of Andover at the county line. And the National Weather Service issues the update to their tornado warning. And they say at 8:13, just a little bit after, observed tornado, a confirmed tornado located near Andover moving northeast. So they're adding that extra oomph to their warning language by saying a confirmed tornado is on the ground based on that spotter reports coming in. Because let me do a little scenario here. So let's say you're sitting in your house, all your bells and whistles go off, your phone, your NOAA weather radio, because you still got one of those, and you hear the National Weather Service has issued a tornado warning for Butler County, including the city of Andover, for radar indicated rotation. What does your spidey sense go? Okay, let me go take a look. Now, let's say the message instead comes out and it says, boop, the National Weather Service has issued a tornado warning for Butler County, including the city of Andover. At boop, boop time, 8:46 p.m., spotters reported a large and damaging tornado on the ground headed toward the city. Now, what is your reaction? Still probably running outside to look, right? But at least now, this moment, you're going, wait a minute, confirmed, observed, on the ground, doing damage, that kind of language, getting that message across to people, it's so much different when you have eyes on it versus, well, we have a radar indicated rotation, so we're issuing a tornado warning. And most people are like, radar indicated rotation, whatever. But when you have a report that somebody else has seen it, yeah, we do have some tendency to go verify for ourselves. Really? They saw it? And we got to run and look too. But it carries so much more weight when you say it's confirmed, it's observed. And this animation here, that yellow, or it's yellow, color troubles today. The white shape that's drawn is not a warning or watch box or anything. It's just the National Weather Service wanting to draw your attention to that area of the screen. So you notice that initially there's nothing down at the bottom of that little white box. And then as the storm leaves, something starts to appear and you see a ball and it's moving kind of along with the storm and kind of moving away from the storm. You know what that is? That's where the tornado was. And do you know why it shows up as that little ball like that? Exactly. It was the debris. That's what's called a debris ball. Had the National Weather Service waited until they could see something on radar to issue that warning, at what point do you finally see something on radar? I mean, it's well across the county line. It's well through the city. It was probably across Highway 54 already at that point. So by taking those other two factors, environment and spotter reports, they gained so much more lead time rather than saying, well, until we see it on radar, we can't act. Interestingly enough, so as it was over this side of the county, we had a low precipitation supercell. Lots of clear skies around it, nothing on radar indicating the tornado was there, lots of missing parts and pieces as you're looking at that radar image. So not a classic textbook supercell. Now you fast forward by an hour and look at the image at the bottom, 9:11 p.m. That's looking a lot more like a classic supercell, right? Same system, just opposite end of the county. Now, I don't know where it found some moisture, but now it's got lots of moisture in it. Now it's showing up on radar. Now you've got a regular level of precipitation supercell, and you have that classic look, your anvil, your outflow or your downdraft area where the rain and hail is, the hook echo. And if you look at your comparison between the base velocity, you look at the top, you don't really see that bright green, bright red beside each other, but do you at the bottom? Actually, it's like bright blue and bright red, really bad things. Anybody see the wording that's right next to it? Rosalia, yeah. That was, as it hit the opposite end of the county, produced the second tornado of the night, an EF1, that fortunately, as it got to Rosalia, it kind of went boop and went above it to the north, was kind of angling straight toward it. But that one ended up being rated an EF1. So wind speeds here were more in the 155 plus in that tornado. Wind speeds in that one were about 100 miles per hour. Interestingly enough, though, width-wise, they were the exact same width as their widest point, quarter of a mile. Which tells you, if you ever have anybody that tells you that they can rate a tornado just by looking at it, so they're looking at radar, or they're looking at footage from Mississippi or something, they're like, oh, look, it looks like an EF4 tornado is hitting Mississippi. Just based on looking at the structure of it, they don't know what they're talking about, because the tornado size has nothing to do with it. The width, the height, the shape, it all has to do with the amount of wind speed in the tornado and the amount of damage it produces. That's what gets it the EF rating. Okay, so the last little bit we have here is just really driving home that spotter component. And what I want to really clarify is that nowadays, and kind of touched on this earlier, spotters are not just affiliated with a TV station. They are not just affiliated with a fire department. They are not just affiliated with my department. Spotters have pretty much become everybody. Because now in this day and age of all the smartphone technology and the ability for somebody to get on their phone, take a picture, and transmit it to a really wide audience really, really fast has kind of changed the landscape. And now, essentially, all of the general public has become spotters as well. And all that information they have, if that can just get to someone, can help make that difference. Because remember that whole credibility thing. When you get confirmed in the message, when you get observed in the message, you really add to the ability for the public to perk up and take notice, like, oh, this is real. And also to help the National Weather Service, if they're really on that line, like the case on April 29th, they're like, radar doesn't tell the story. Environment tells the story. We need that extra piece. that spotter information, those eyes on the storm, becomes that extra piece that can nudge them over the line if they're really on the fence about something. So if you are going to report severe weather, like I said, you don't have to be affiliated with anyone officially to report severe weather. So first, let's talk about what you should report. So the typical storm hazards that are typically considered reportable, you got your tornadoes, your hail, your wind, and your flooding. When it comes to what the Weather Service will warn on, well, any shape, size, form of tornado typically gets a tornado warning. You do occasionally have, when I said the environment is just totally wrong and you get a little dust devil, you get a little land spout, sometimes they won't warn on those because they know those are not going to amount to anything. The environment is wrong. All they're going to do is just kind of spin around a bit in the field. So those maybe won't get a tornado warning. But most of the time, you report a tornado, it should progress to a tornado warning. For severe thunderstorms, the minimum criteria to be a severe thunderstorm is either 58-mile-per-hour wind gusts or quarter-size hail, or they can be both. And then flash floods, that's kind of case by case. They kind of look at the amount of rainfall, the amount of impact, where it's falling over, what kind of reports are coming in about impacts to roads, impacts to cities, impacts to people. The other hazard that's out there is lightning, but you don't have to tell us you see lightning. Just, hey, there was lightning. Great, enjoy the show. So reporting, what to report. So even though there is a minimum criteria to issue a warning, it doesn't mean the National Weather Service only wants to hear about stuff that's over that level. Obviously, if you're having golf ball-sized hail, baseball-sized hail, they want to know about that. But pea-sized hail can be very important to note as well. So we've got a storm that as it was coming to Wichita, it was producing golf ball-sized hail, and so it got warned for the potential for golf ball-sized hail. And now it's moving into Butler County, and you all go out and you watch the storm from a safe, sheltered location where you're not going to get hit by the golf ball-sized hail. And you're looking and you're going, that's just pea-sized hail. That is great information for the Weather Service to have because something has changed. The storm has changed, the environment has changed. It could be that this storm is now losing fuel, it's losing power, it's decaying, and maybe it doesn't deserve a warning anymore. So even though that's not warning criteria hail, it can help drive a decision. If you're going to report hail, use something pretty standardized as your unit of measure. I mean, you can get as specific as getting a ruler and measuring and, oh yeah, that's 1 3/4 inch hail. Don't do it while it's still actively falling if you're going to do that measurement technique. But you can actually measure it, or you can compare it to something like quarter-sized hail or half-dollar-sized hail or baseball-sized hail. Don't use marbles. The National Weather Service doesn't like marbles because I guess there's different sizes of marbles and they don't know which kind you mean if you say marbles. So they're always like, no marbles. So nickels instead of marbles maybe. And use something that all of us are familiar with. Because if you're like, this hail was as big as my Yorkie's head. I don't know if you have a normal Yorkie or like a mutant Yorkie. So, maybe not use your Yorkie as a standard of measurement, but something standardized. When it comes to wind, we do want to get an idea of how strong the winds are. So if you could estimate it, you're looking at the tree movement and you're like, yeah, I've lived in Kansas all my life, and at about 40 miles per hour, it does this. And I can estimate it's about 40 miles per hour. If you have equipment that actually measures it, you have an anemometer at your house or your station, and you're like, measured wind gusts of 62 miles per hour. That's cool too. Some people do that. But some kind of estimate of wind speed. But additionally, what we need to know and what tells us a story about that storm is if it's doing damage as well. So if it's breaking off tree limbs, if it's uprooting trees, if it knocked down your fence or peeled off shingles on your roof, that's all important information. And as specific as you can get, the better. So instead of just, well, I got sticks all over my yard, to say, well, I've got 1 inch diameter tree limbs, or I've got an 8-foot diameter tree uprooted. Those tell a really different story. So specifics are great. Anything related to tornadoes are very reportable. Rotating wall clouds, funnel clouds, tornadoes, all that kind of stuff. We definitely want to know about that sooner than later. And then flooding, just any descriptors you have, like the water is over the road at this location, or water rescues are in process. That's the good thing we like to know about. Or there's a bunch of people stalling out at this intersection from the water. Especially if it's flooding where it never has flooded before, that kind of tells us something too. And then as you're giving your report, make sure you clarify a couple additional things. When did it happen, especially if there was a delay in reporting? If the hail's happening right now and you're like, I currently have baseball-sized hail in my backyard, okay, that's great. If the tornado was moving in and you took shelter and changed location or something and it took you 5 to 10 minutes to call the report in, make sure you clarify that delay. And the other thing is your location in relation to whatever it is. Typically when somebody's observing wind and observing hail or tree damage or something, we assume that it's in the same location you're at. With tornadoes, if you're like, yeah, I'm currently at the north end of Andover and I've got a giant wedge-shaped tornado. Well, if you don't add any other clarifying details, the assumption is that you and the wedge-shaped tornado are both in the city. But if you instead clarify, I'm at the north end of Andover and I'm looking toward Benton, and somewhere between Andover and Benton there appears to be a wedge-shaped tornado on the ground. That's a good clarifying piece of information. Now, if you want to share directly to the Weather Service, say you're a member of the general public and you're really active on Twitter and you want to go out and do some tweeting with the National Weather Service, that's one of the platforms that they have really fallen in love with. These guys love Twitter. It's fast. I mean, they get that instantaneous report. You can include pictures with it. I mean, they monitor Twitter very extensively during storms. You have the ability to actually direct it to them by using their handle at NWS Wichita. That'll get the Wichita office. And then if you're a hashtagger, if you include the hashtag KSWX, everybody who follows Kansas weather pretty much follows that hashtag. So then not just will Wichita weather see it, but like everybody gets to see your pictures in your report. So they recommend doing both. They do have a Facebook page that they'll monitor that as well, maybe not quite as closely as Twitter. So Twitter's still their #1 for if you're gonna tweet them something. And I think the media, pretty much, they like Twitter stuff as well. So yeah, if you'd rather talk to, Ross and his new dog, May, is it May, the new dog? Yeah. If you'd like Ross and May to get the story first, I guess tweet them. If you're old school and you just want to call the report into the National Weather Service, they do have an 800 number. They clarify very strongly, this is for storm reports. If you are calling in a storm report, like I have hail, I have wind, not I have a barbecue on Saturday and I have 50 relatives showing up and I really need you to tell me it's going to be sunny. That's not what that number's for. And then, if you are going to report to us, especially if you're a member of public safety, hopefully all of you fire and law folks in here already know that we do our storm spotter coordination. If you're reporting into us, we do our coordination on EMA ops. So if you have something to report, come on over to our channel and let us know. If you happen to be a ham radio operator and you like to be out and doing ham stuff, I'm not a ham, so I don't know a lot of the technical terms with hams, but if you're out hamming around and you want to report, we got some hams in the back, and you want to report that way, they have a severe weather net that they'll stand up when weather's active at 147.150, and I think I had that verified as correct, yes? Okay, so you can report that way. For those of you who might want to call reports into our office, I will tell you we're kind of like in a state of flux right now. So typically we've done our severe weather operations when we're activated in our office, and our office number is the 733 number. But just a couple of years ago, they built us a new operations center, the county did, and it's finally, the operations center is operational. And the phone system that they put in that does not talk to the phone system in our office. So we're figuring out how to, if people still have the old number, how to get them to our new number. So pick up a phone, dial something, maybe somebody will answer. So those are those two numbers. I also will tell you, for those of you guys that interact with us on the public safety side, if it's one of those marginal storms, like it's 2 o'clock in the morning and it's warned for quarter-sized hail, I'm not going to get up and go into the office. If you have something to report, absolutely call it into me. But I'm probably sitting in my fuzzy bunny slippers at home with my radio and my laptop up, and so don't call the office number then. And then the other option is, that's county dispatch's number. You guys here in Andover probably just would call your dispatch and say, hey, can you relay to Butler County Emergency Management that we got nasty stuff happening? So that's an option as well. All right, and whoa. And yeah, there, now you can look at the thank you for coming slide. So what questions do you have?
I have a question. I don't know if you know this. If you register for National Weather Service at spot offending on these meetings, they have, and he would call you and let you know what's going on. I've had several calls.
Oh,
After past the YMCA, in the past, they had called me, what's it doing after work? I guess you've got reports, they want to know about this. They called me several times. I even called a while back when all the power lines went down to the fourth from about 9-6. They want to know if I was close enough to anything about it. No, I'm not that close. 3 miles, 4 miles down the road. But if you wish with them, they can take your phone and the website. And they didn't get a hold of me. I was surprised when I got a phone call. This and that's worse. What's the weather doing? What? They're calling me?
so are you formally registered as a co-op observer? Is that what they call you?
Well,
Is it, or just an
I
observer?
was registered. I didn't get to go to the meeting over together.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But then I guess they call for, they're, just citizens type deal.
Mm-hmm.
And we're like this, so they could count. And then they go through the same thing.
Yeah, if you want to get affiliated with them very distinct or definitively, they do have, and I think it's their co-op observer program. Yeah, enroll with that.
Yeah, it's just, like you said, just everyday people.
Mm-hmm.
That they need to get all of you, because you give your, I guess, apparently they know where you live or your address. If there's something around you, they will call you. That's what I said. I was surprised. They called you.
And you know what? Your storm reports will show up on that NWS chat feed, because all of a sudden we'll have co-op observer reports, like 3.5 inches of rain or something. Another thing that they really like is if you ever want to be a CocoRa's observer, those are the people that put up the rain gauges in their yard and they take rain measurements and they post them to a website every day. And that's how they get a lot of their precipitation measurements, is all these, the acronym is CocoRa's. But those type of observers are always wanted as well, and there's a way you can sign up, and I think they even provide your rain gauge, so if you want to measure rain and stuff, you can get involved that way as well. All right, any other questions, thoughts, comments? Because otherwise we have reached the end of the program, and you are free to grab on the way out, because I don't think Megan wants to store them anywhere. And then any information you want to get, we've got some members of our volunteer team back there, our community emergency response team and our animal response team, that would love to visit with you about any preparedness questions you have. But other than that, you guys are free to get out of here. Thanks for coming.